We are going to talk today about answering politics disads. And for kind of argumentative background, what do I mean when I say politics disads? Go ahead. Good. Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of a politics dissad is that the AF changes or affects the political climate in ways that have particular effects. So like Arjun said, either on a given agenda item or on electoral outcomes. So an effect that is on the political, that changes the current political climate. And we can think of lots of different examples of these kinds of disads. Agenda disads might be link arguments about political capital. They might, which, you know, is a finite store of goodwill that is oriented toward getting particular agenda items complete. They might be oriented around bipartisanship or the idea of both parties working together. They might be oriented around olive branches or concessions, which is kind of like, I give you something as an olive branch, as a peace offering that helps other items get accomplished. They might be based on horse trading, which is the idea of exchanging one political favor for another. So you can horse trade, kind of, I'll vote for this item if you vote for that item. They can be based on riders, which are kind of legislative attachments to must pass legislation. So there's all kinds of different examples of agenda politics disads. There are also elections disads, as was mentioned, which can be oriented around the idea of turnout, or the idea that certain people will show up to vote, will or won't show up to vote based on what is happening in the national political environment. They can be based on vote switching, or the idea that you might or might not vote for one candidate versus another based on particular dynamics. They can be based on up and down ballot effects, which are usually focused on specific demographics or group of voters. What do I mean by up or down ballot effects? Hi, who are you?
I'm
Callie, got it.
Sorry, I just got lost for a second.
No worries, just wanting to keep track of where people are, so glad you made it. So who knows what I mean by up or down ballot effects? Yeah.
Would up ballot effects be issues that are very prevalent or like on people's minds?
No, that's not quite what I mean, but good. I mean, I think that you're referring to like issues that are salient, you know, in the political discourse, which is definitely important for elections. I said, hi, are you Ben? Hercules. Okay, welcome. So up or down ballot just refers to when you go to vote at a given, you should maybe slide back just a little bit. I'm trying to keep a safe distance. There you go, perfect. Up or down ballot just refers to when you go to the polls, you will vote for, in an election that you're planning to vote for, the candidates that you want to select. But there are also other elections that happen at the same time. So like when you go to vote for the presidential election, there are also congressional candidates on the ballot. That's a down ballot that is referred to as down ballot. So when the presidential election has particular effects on congressional races, that is called a down ballot effect. And what is the reverse, that maybe local or regional candidates in an election have, you know, knock-on effects for candidates further up the ballot, that's referred to up ballot effects. So I want to quickly go over reasons that people say that politics disads are both good and bad. I know this is the AF versus politics lecture, and we're mostly going to be making fun of politics, but I want to quickly cover reasons politics disads are good. I think the politics disads are good because they're the real reason that most AFs have not already been done. So you remember in the demo debate when, you know, DKP asked Tyler, like, hey, if your AF is such a good idea, like, why hasn't it been done? And one of Tyler's responses is like, well, there's political costs involved. That is a typical reason that, you know, the very AF biased, liberally biased literature that tends to agree with particular AFs should be done, do not then take place. You know, there's just a lot of work that goes into getting a given policy done, and a lot of the effects or consequences tend to be political. So politics disads are the reason most asks have not already been done. The second reason I think politics disads are good is that they're a true generic that can apply across the board to most affirmatives. If you have cards about the likely political effects or consequences of a given affirmative, you have the makings of a disad, which is more than you could say for most, disads, especially on a topic with link uniqueness problems like this one. I think politics disads are good. Third, because they're research intensive and reward hard work. It takes a lot of cards to effectively pull off a politics disad, and I think that is a benefit that we can say politics disads are beneficial for that reason. Fourth, I think politics disads relate to issues that matter to people in the moment. So a lot of what we talk about in debate is like pretty esoteric and arcane. You're not going to find a lot of people around you who are super jazzed up about the idea of working with NATO over biotech and things like that. But politics disads relate to issues that people do care about, like the current drug pricing bill or the, midterm elections and who's going to win or lose them. So there are, kind of real life effects and ways, and politics disads are a way that kind of connect the esoteric, the arcane, the policy specific to the bigger picture kind of political climate, which people tend to be more interested in. And finally, I think politics disads can be good because they educate us on the political process. So we learn a little bit about how Congress works, about how elections work. Debating politics disads requires knowing some stuff about those things, which I think is another benefit. On the other hand, politics disads are terrible for a number of reasons. First is that most politics disads are heavily contrived. So, it is unlikely to be the case that, the single issue that will make or break whether Congress agrees to antitrust legislation will be whether we do a little bit more cooperation with NATO over cybersecurity or AI or biotech, right? Like in actuality, that is unlikely to be the make or break for whether that particular legislation gets passed.
Sorry, I got one.
You're good. Are you Suhani?
I'm Asha.
You're Asha. Okay, sorry. No, we have Suhani already. Okay. The second reason that politics disads are problematic is that they bastardize the political process. So when I said we learn about the political process, that is sort of a misnomer, right? Because what we learn is like, well, this particular agenda item either will or won't pass, and then we're going to assert that the plan drives a wedge in the political agreements and bipartisan set of accords that makes it impossible. Like, that's not really how most politics works. And so really what we're talking about when we learn about the political process through politics disads is a bastardization of the political process. So that's a second reason that politics disads are problematic, is that they kind of take what is, a genuinely educationally valuable concept and then say, we're going to learn the ways that we can twist it to make it a debate argument. Third, politics disads minimize topic specific education. So if you go the whole year, only debating whether NATO cooperation is the wedge that prevents a bunch of Biden's agenda from getting passed, you're not really learning a lot about the topic, are you? You're learning, sorry, one second. You're learning about the political consequences or the political effects of those things, but not the topic itself, right? So politics disads can be problematic because they minimize topic specific education. Fourth, politics disads maximize the role of hired guns. So, there are some debate programs, obviously debate programs come in different shapes and sizes. There are some with a lot of resources that are able to hire kind of college coaches or college debaters or just people who can crank out politics disads and answers to politics disads. And that is how they, do a lot of their research. So politics disads maximize the role of those people because it is, highly cost effective to hire out, like, okay, we don't want to figure out what's going on in the political agenda. So you figure that out for us and then we'll be taken care of. Which is kind of a resource inequality argument that people make about why politics disads maximize sort of resource inequalities. And finally, the reason that politics disads, we might say, are bad is that they allow people to be lazy because if you just get good at the one argument. Maybe you're not debating other arguments. Maybe you're just locked in as the politics debater who will go for agenda or midterms all year long, and you're not learning anything else. I guess this sort of ties back to the kind of education related arguments, but those are some reasons that people say that politics disads are bad. I think it is useful to have both politics disads good and politics disads bad as like, kind of a block that you have. You never know when someone might say like, hey, your T interpretation means that we only debate politics, and you want to be able to say that's actually a good thing, or you want to be able to say, hey, your interpretation really only allows politics as a generic, and you want to be able to say that's bad. Additionally, if you have politics theory debates, which is something that we'll talk about today as kind of one of the tools in your arsenal against politics, you want to be able to back up the reasons that your theory interpretation is good with some of the reasons that politics disads are bad. So that is that's a few kind of argumentative background things. I want to talk a little bit about why politics disads are worse now than they used to be. So it used to be that you would hear kind of the full range or scope of all of those different kind of link arguments that I talked about at the beginning, and all of them had, sort of equal plausibility, and you were equally likely to hear any of them. That is no longer true. You'll go the vast majority of your debate career only hearing the political capital version of an agenda disad, and you'll probably hear only versions of elections disad that involve kind of generic like vote switching or generic turnout. You are not as likely to hear some of the more specific versions of these disads that used to exist, and that is obviously for the worse. So what has changed that has kind of produced these effects? I think there's a few national political trends that have emerged over the past sort of decade or so that have produced the political climate that we find ourselves in, which make politics disads sort of less compelling and less rich in their ability to kind of wed the topic debates that we have with the political climate. So the first big change or shift in the national political environment that I think makes politics disads bad is political polarization and hyper-partisanship. Who knows what I mean by either polarization or partisanship? Go ahead, Jake.
Polarization is like separation or like becoming less togetherness, like pulling into like you're either like a Republican or a Democrat, and like there's not an in between, and like policies are either like along party lines, and only person who's in the majority can pass anything, but no one's going to agree with anything from the other side.
Yeah, good. So polarization is the idea that there are two political poles. There's the left and the right, and the vast majority of people, both at the kind of top of our political party system and people kind of just everyday people, cluster around those two poles and kind of stick there rigidly and don't have a lot of interest in the other side, in learning about what the other side has to say, let alone kind of supporting policies or items that might be proposed by the other side. And then hyperpartisanship refers to something very similar, which is like, what Jake referred to about, kind of you're either a Republican or you're a Democrat, and that filters everything about politics, that you view things as either good for Republicans and thus bad for me if I'm a Democrat, or good for Democrats and good for me if I'm a Democrat, bad if I'm a Republican, etc. So kind of clustering around the extremes on the political spectrum to the detriment of any kind of ability to work across the aisle or to agree with or support policies or ideas that are put forth by the other side. The second political kind of trend that has influenced the way in which our politics plays out, and consequently the way politics disads might play out, is there's less split ticket voting than there used to be. And this refers to a similar idea to what we were just talking about, but who knows what split ticket voting is? Yeah.
It's like on a demo racial and
yeah, exactly. So the idea that you get a ballot and it has, a number of different candidates for different offices, and for some offices you vote for Republican, for some offices you vote for Democrat, for some offices maybe you vote independent, but the idea that you split your ticket as opposed to party line voting where you just go down and vote for the same party all the way down the ballot. And split ticket voting has substantially decreased or declined over time. So, the example that was cited there, I think you said from 2000, the year 2000.
Well, the late 2000s, like Arkansas.
Oh, 08. Yeah. So voted for McCain for the presidency, but a Democratic governor. Senator. Yes. Perfect. So, that kind of thing is a lot less common. You don't see it as much anymore. And so as a result, the elections disad that hypothesize that people might be generally in one camp or the other, but might vote for a candidate of the opposite party for particular reasons is a little bit less, believable. It's a little bit more specious because that kind of thing just doesn't happen as much anymore. A third effect that we see in our politics disads related to national political trends is the narrowing of the agenda. So Congress, has congressional mandate to pass legislation is not seen in quite the same light as perhaps it used to be, insofar as rather than a lot of policies being debated and passed through Congress all the time, we see sort of a limited agenda, a narrow set of policies that are less and less likely to make it to the Senate or House floor in the first place to be debated on. And once they get there, are less and less likely to pass. So we see a narrowing of the political agenda. The fourth change, and this is back again related to elections, is gerrymandering. So who knows what gerrymandering is? Go ahead, Jake.
Gerrymandering, so every few years, the party in power in specific states will redraw the district lines in a state, like based on population and different changes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like certain standards you have to meet, but the politicians in power will try, or shouldn't, but sometimes they will gerrymander it to try to make it very beneficial for their party, like grouping like all like a majority of Republicans in this area, or like excluding all these people from a specific area, and like making districts that like are very like not natural to you or something, so they can benefit their own party as much as possible.
Yeah, exactly. So drawing political districts in a very deliberate way to maximize the political power of a particular party. And that makes it so that elections are less up for grabs, because once you've consolidated power among one party in a particular district, that district is very likely to vote the way that you've intended for it to vote, right? They're going to vote for the party that with the greatest concentration of people that has been deliberately engineered. So that makes it, again, unlikely that there is a shift possible in the national political environment that could produce a different set of election outcomes, because you've set up the election outcomes kind of in advance to be a particular way. And then a final shift that I think is very open for debate and can be something that you cut cards about and read evidence about in debates, but the accuracy of pundits' predictions is in question. So, the 2016 election in which Trump was elected was kind of shock to the pundit system, insofar as political pundits across the board said that Clinton was going to win, said Trump had no chance, that the electoral college favored Clinton, and that it was very unlikely that Trump would win. And then obviously he did. And so that called into question the accuracy, the believability, the credibility of a lot of political pundits who make their living kind of making these kinds of predictions. And if those predictions are not accurate, then your disad maybe has some credibility problems itself, right? So if we can't really trust what the political pundits say is going to happen, then that calls into question the accuracy of kind of your disads predictions. So that's another change. I'm going to go through a little bit more detail. There's a Jonathan Haidt and Sam Abrams article from 2015 called "The Top 10 Reasons American Politics Are So Broken." This is from the Washington Post in 2015. And so the discourse around politics had sort of risen to a fever pitch around like, hey, I think that there's something broken in our political system. And note that this was 2015. So this was before Trump, right? So we had already reached a a moment in our political discourse in which the Washington Post is saying like, hey, here's how politics is broken. And then Trump got elected. So like, you can see that from there, things only metastasized in terms of the problems in the political system. But I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. We've already talked about a lot of them, but the first is ideological purification. So when we talked about polarization, the idea is that, you know, there's two parties and you align yourself very strongly with one or the other. The process of ideological purification is one in which the sort of people who believe more to the center of a given set of issues within the party are kind of expunged. They're kind of an example of this might be people who are liberal saying we do not want any anti-abortion liberals in the party. So we'll do everything that we can to kind of push people who are against abortion out of the party. So ideological purification is the idea that each political party came to, kind of excise or get rid of a lot of the more moderate elements in their party so that there is only the extremes left, only those two poles. Second is that Americans polarize along with Congress. So people, average Americans who follow or don't follow what is going on at the national political level, they might have their own ideas about politics, but what has happened is that it has increasingly been the case that people follow what they see at the national political level. And so Americans polarize along with Congress has produced an environment in which people are less likely to come to agreement or to work in a bipartisan fashion, even at the local level. Third is the deepening of the urban-rural divide. So you've probably heard the term coastal elite or some other term that refers to the idea that there is a divide between urban areas sort of politically and ideologically and rural areas in terms of what they believe and what their politics are. And that divide has deepened over time. There's sociological data to reflect the idea that people are much more likely to believe a given set of policies or issues if they live in an urban area versus a rural area. So you can probably imagine some of the examples of kind of what this looks like, some of the guns, abortion, some of the major, fault lines in American politics, that what you believe and where you live are highly correlated. Fourth, rising immigration reflects ethnic and racial divisions. So there are ethnic and racial disagreements and divisions in American political life that the continued ongoing rise in immigration has continued to deepen those divides rather than kind of, ameliorating them or causing some more agreement or meeting in the middle. Those divides continue to be deepened as immigration continues to rise. Intense partisan dislike is the next one. So there's lots of data that like people on the left perceive Mitch McConnell to be like the top hated figure in American politics. People on the right believe Nancy Pelosi to be like the devil. There's just like a genuine dislike between the parties that has entrenched and intensified over time that, makes it, again, very unlikely that you're willing to say like, okay, some things that the other side says are legitimate because you're like, no, I hate them. They're the worst. And that is a trend that has continued to intensify. Next is that there are rule and culture changes in Congress that minimize cross-party friendships. So one of the long-term kind of big picture ways in which we see this trend play out is that in the 20th century, Congress can, I wouldn't hold up Congress as like a beacon, a shining light of whatever, but there certainly have been impressive legislative accomplishments over the course of the 20th century that reflect some deal making, some people on each side going across their party to agree with one another. And there are rule and culture changes in Congress that have made that less likely, so that people are less likely to become friends with people of the opposite party. And so you can read about this kind of on your own because it's fairly arcane and dense, but there's some rule changes around committee chairships that kind of concentrate power in the committee chairs and make it so, and decrease the incentives to generate friendships across party lines. So rule and culture changes in Congress have intensified a lot of the above. through the ways that the rules are written and the ways that the culture kind of plays out. Next is changes in the media environment. So the big, probably the best example of a change in the media environment is the nationalization of media and the loss of local news media, because the increasing like outflux of local news that people used to get their news from kind of local sources. It is now much more common to get your news not only nationally, but also from social media, which, as you have probably heard, has a high likelihood of reinforcing your existing beliefs rather than exposing you to other things that you don't already consider to be true. So changes in the media environment, both in terms of nationalization, in terms of increasing social mediaization, I don't think that's a word, but we're going to go with it, have shifted how people get their news and get their information, which intensifies all of the trends that we're talking about. Next is the rising campaign costs, which increase pressure to cater to donors. So it has gotten so much more expensive to pay for a political campaign than it used to be. So, back in the day, I don't know when this is, but theoretically you could run for office with like $10 in a dream, right? If you're like committed to being a public servant, you could run for office, you could achieve that dream, with some grassroots campaigning and like not that much money. That is not super true anymore because the cost of campaigning has just skyrocketed. And so that means that politicians get a bunch of their money from donors. The donors fund their campaigns, the ability to run for office in the first place. So once you're in office, what effects does that naturally have? You got to keep those people happy. You got to pay it back by supporting policies that those donors support and not supporting anything that those donors oppose, right? So that has a very obvious corrosive effect on people making decisions kind of organically, or making decisions based on the best interests of their constituents, and rather results in a set of policies that are kind of baked in by what the donor class wants. A change that is sort of interesting that people don't think about that much maybe is the loss of the USSR as a common enemy. So the Soviet Union, in the mid to late 20th century really motivated a lot of American politics in terms of like, we have a common enemy that we're trying to defeat. And the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 20th century really changed that dynamic, or changed that landscape, so that there became no longer a unifying ideological threat that people could come together and say, okay, we're going to defeat this common enemy. That enemy no longer existed once the Soviet Union fell. So that changed kind of the way that people thought about, the goals of their political work. And so the fall of the Soviet Union resulted in the loss of a common enemy, which changed, minimized some of the pre-existing incentives to work across the aisle. And then, yeah, go ahead. That's a really good question. I think that we have yet to see what the defining, the next defining threat will look like. And I think that a couple of thoughts I have there. One is that in between kind of the fall of the Soviet Union and the current emergence of China as a geopolitical rival, that terrorism was maybe the possible kind of intermediate common enemy. The problem there being that there was never a lot of agreement on the level of threat that terrorism posed. We saw the direct threatening of American interests was pretty minimal, except for 9/11. And so I think there are reasons that terrorism never really coalesced as like in that role. I think that China has the potential to do so, like you're saying, but I think that there is so much disagreement about the kind of threat that China might pose, the level of the threat, and the best way to respond to it, that I think that I would be surprised if there was a similar unifying response to China as there was to the Soviet Union, just for the fragmentation of the, like there's even among, the think tank elite, right? There's very little agreement on like, this is definitely a threat, or, this is a form of competition that does not have to be against each other. Just like there's a lot of different takes on China that I think make it more difficult for that unifying element to happen. But I think that's a really good question. The last kind of change, national political change that I want to talk about is just the baton pass from the greatest generation to baby boomers. So the greatest generation was the generation previous to the baby boomers that, fought in world wars and, kind of brought home a set of ideals about the American cause and wanted to kind of see the best version of their country that they could possibly see. This is obviously a gross oversimplification, and it's not like everyone in that generation felt a particular way or acted a particular way. But in general, like, again, in a just gross oversimplification, you can see a difference between the way the greatest generation treated American politics and the way that baby boomers have treated American politics, insofar as the latter is a little bit less interested in like a common vision of the best possible America than the previous generation was. Okay, I want to talk about actual debating of politics for kind of the rest of this morning, now that we've talked about some background. So some top level thoughts about debating politics on the AF. One is that hard work is rewarded. Much like the disad on the negative, you want to invest time in learning about the scenarios that you're likely to debate. So I would not want to go into this year without a good idea of what the different agenda items are that are being prioritized. One of the changes that we talked about the narrowing of the agenda is particularly enforced right now because of midterms. So no one thinks that very much is going to get done in Congress before the midterm election happens, but there are some things that are on the agenda, and I would want to know what those are and what their comparative likelihood of getting to a floor vote, getting possibly passed would be. Second, you want to perfect your 2AC blocks on politics. So 2AC blocks on politics should be as good as they can possibly be. You want to make them efficient. You want to make arguments at every level of the disad. And you want to make the block as hard as possible. So the way that the negative wins most politics debates is by overwhelming the AF with evidence, with kind of analytics and distinctions, and kind of just, taking advantage of the negative block to throw everything possible at the wall and then, kind of pick up the wreckage in the 2NR. You want to make that hard for the negative, and you want to do that in the 2AC. So you want to make arguments at every single level of the disad, rather than like, I've got my non-unique, I've got my, link turn, and then I've got some impact D. You want to make link uniqueness arguments. You want to make impact uniqueness arguments. You want to make no internal link arguments. You want to make internal link presses. Those are the same. But you want to make arguments at every level of the disad. I think that many politics disads can be defeated through some smart defensive arguments and winning a solvency deficit or a good risk of your advantage. And you can set yourself up to do that by making arguments analytically in the 2AC that kind of poke holes in the logic of the argument presented by the negative. And just smart analytic arguments against the disad. Sure thing. You also want to think about what your like case outweighs frame is against politics disads. Just like think about what about your AF is sort of a controlling impact or a decisive one that you think that faced with the possibility of averting the impact to your AF versus averting the impact to like the drug pricing disad, that you're going to force the judge's hand on the case outweighs. Just like think about what your big picture approach is in terms of your impact compared to the impact of the disad. I want to talk next about cross-ex of the 1NC, because I think this is a really important time for debating politics disads and for beating them that people don't maybe pay enough attention to. So first, you want to compare uniqueness claims to link claims made by the negative. So why will X pass now or happen now? And why does the plan mean those things are no longer true? So like, to take an example that you may have debated this past year and may eventually debate some version of again, the like infrastructure bill. So the reasons that people said an infrastructure bill will pass is because of public pressure. It's because of desire to see Congress accomplish something legislatively. And it's because our American infrastructure is like crumbling and falling apart, right? Uniqueness evidence that says this bill will pass has to account for those things. It has to reference those things being true. Why does the plan mean that those things are no longer true, right? All of the factors or reasons behind here is why a given bill is going to pass now, most of them will be unrelated to the link argument that is being made by the negative, right? Like it is, political capital is unrelated to the structural features or the structural factors that make a bill likely to pass. So you want to compare uniqueness to link evidence and ask why the link means that the uniqueness claims are no longer true. Another version of this question or way of getting at some of this is to ask who is going to vote for the bill now that will no longer support it after the plan happens, right? So who is like on board, signed up, ready to support and pass, a drug pricing bill, an infrastructure bill, an antitrust bill, compete with China bill, who after the plan is like, ooh, well, my constituents really like this bill and I've been under a lot of pressure and I, think that it's probably a good idea, but like this co-op bill passed. And so like, ooh, I'm not super sure about that anymore. Like, who are those people? Like, get them to name names. You also want to ask about the thesis or theory of the link itself. So, like I said, you're highly likely to debate political capital disads. I would ask the negative, what is political capital? And get them on the record about what political capital is. So, they might start out by saying political capital is the sort of store of influence or goodwill that a president or a leader can use to get a particular agenda item passed. And then you want to say, how does the president use political capital? Like, what does that look like? And they're like, well, it means making phone calls or office visits. It means kind of exerting pressure on Congress people to agree with this particular bill. Okay, great. So why does the plan mean that Biden can no longer get on the horn with Manchin and be like, hey, I need you to pass this, right? Like, what about the plan changes the mechanics of how political capital plays out in actuality? Or is it about like, okay, maybe it's a store of goodwill and you've used up that goodwill. Well, why would it be the case that Biden would use up his goodwill on the plan? Like, why bother trying to get Manchin on board with security co-op with NATO if he knows that the next thing is going to happen, that the next thing coming down the bend is much more important, right? So like either a set of questions and probably a combination of some questions about the logistics or the mechanics of the link and of the like theory behind who is it that you think is making these moves or taking these particular actions, and why would they do that knowing that logically, why would this be the case knowing what is coming up next? So why and how does the plan affect the president's ability to use political capital to get things done? I would ask a lot of questions about those things. Next, you always want to cross-ex the negative about the internal links to their impact. So it is one thing to have a piece of evidence that says that it would be really good if we passed this drug pricing bill. It would have all of these like great effects. It is a whole other thing and a much less common thing that the negative has a piece of evidence that says failure to pass this single bill is like make or break for that impact argument. That this is, if we do not pass this drug pricing bill, the economy will collapse. Or if we do not pass this antitrust bill, we will lose all technological leadership. Like it is very rare that you find the piece of evidence that is like a break with uniqueness that is reverse causal, that makes all the claims that the negative wants to claim about their disad, right? So scrutinize the internal link evidence and ask questions about it in cross-ex. I think it is also helpful in cross-ex of the 1NC to ask questions about author qualifications. Often politics evidence is written by lobbyists or others with vested financial interests in particular outcomes. So that sets up an author bias argument for you. The rest of the time, it's usually random staff writers. So like, I don't know why we should care what they think or why, what credibility do they have to make kind of big predictions or claims about the way that this debate is going to play out. So author qualifications is another one. Giving the 2AC on politics. So I sort of foreshadowed this a little bit earlier on, but you want to make arguments at every level. So that means at a minimum, making a uniqueness argument, a link uniqueness argument, a link argument, an internal link argument, and an impact argument. As you're doing that, as you're making arguments on every level of the disad, you do not want to make, you do not want to read more than one card on any given issue. And some of these can be analytics. So you do not have to read cards for every one of the arguments that you made. And you should not read more than one piece of evidence on any given argument, right? And that's for efficiency reasons, because it is inefficient to read multiple cards on a given issue. You have the 1AR, which we're going to talk about, where you're going to read more cards. And you want to make sure that your efficiency is good by getting arguments at every level, but only one argument. Many of these arguments can and should be analytic and can come from cross-sects. So you do not necessarily have to read a card on no internal link to the impact. I would often not read a card on no impact to the impact. So like impact defense, like I have so many problems with politics DAs, and like economic collapse doesn't cause war is really not one of them. But making that argument is fine. I just wouldn't necessarily invest a piece of evidence in it. Random kind of sidebar here, and this is relevant for your debates about the midterms disad. So you've maybe heard that it is structurally very likely that the GOP will win the midterms, and thus that their good kind of uniqueness overwhelms the link arguments. I would not say that in the 2AC. In the 2AC, I would say non-unique. Even if I know 100% that in the 2AR, I want to go for uniqueness overwhelms the link. Does anyone think they can guess why I would want to say non-unique in the 2AC if I think that in the 2AR, I want to go for uniqueness overwhelms the link? Yeah, Jay. Exactly. So if I say non-unique, the neg is going to pull up their big old chunky uniqueness block and read all the reasons that the GOP is going to win now, which is great for me because in the 1AR, I can be like, that's interesting. You have now given these 17 reasons that the GOP is structurally going to win the midterms. We're going to concede all of these arguments to say that the uniqueness is so strong, it overwhelms any possible effects that the plan could have. So make a non-unique in the 2AC, even if you want to go for uniqueness overwhelms. Next, I think that link uniqueness is a very useful category of argument to make in the 2AC. You'll sometimes hear these called thumpers, but it's the argument that something else is going to trigger the link to the disad that is not the plan. This is very useful for a few reasons. It's easy to research because something else is always going on. You know, there's always some other issue happening. There's always something causing focus, costing capital, that is requiring attention. Very easy to find something else that could trigger the link. It is also very difficult for the neg to wiggle out of these arguments without complicating their link story. So if you say, okay, you know, you've said that this bill is going to pass unless something really controversial happens. Here's the thing, like gun control is really controversial and is also being debated right now. So that should trigger your link, right? And the negative, in order to get out of this, has to win. This other controversial issue will not derail drug pricing, but your thing will, but the agenda, the plan will. And so they have to really thread a very fine needle to get around the argument that something else is going to cause the disad. So it's very difficult for the neg to wiggle out of link uniqueness without complicating their own story. Yeah. Okay, who can answer that? Who can tell me what uniqueness overwhelms the link means? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it's basically that the uniqueness is so strong that so it doesn't really like your app doesn't really trigger that. It's like no matter what, this will still happen because like the problem there is like so big that no matter what, this will still happen even which will resolve it.
Exactly. Does that make sense? So to give a concrete example, the midterms disad that we put out for the camp says the GOP is going to win the midterms now, but the plan makes Democrats look good because it makes them look like tough on Russia or whatever. So it causes them to win. The uniqueness overwhelms link would be like, actually the reasons that the GOP is likely to win the midterms are so structural. They're so baked in, like gerrymandering, and like everyone's super pissed off at Biden. And there's a bunch of like, you know, other, just a bunch of reasons that the Republicans are going to win the election that are so strong, they overwhelm an effect that the link could have. So it's like, sure, the plan might make the Democrats look a little bit better on Russia, but these other things are more, have a stronger effect than the plan. Does that make sense? Okay. So link uniqueness, very useful. And the answers to link uniqueness can often be used to prove either winners win or political capital isn't key. So winners win is the argument that when the president does something controversial, it makes them look like a winner who is then more likely to be able to get other agenda items done. So that's a link turn argument that you'll often hear. When you make a link uniqueness argument and you say, hey, Biden is having to spend a bunch of political capital on gun control, and the neg is like, well, that influence that he's spending on gun control will actually translate to more influence over other things. You're like, great, that proves winners win. Or it proves that political capital isn't key if their answer to a link uniqueness argument is like, well, Biden's not really pushing that issue. He's kind of staying out of the mix. That's like, okay, well, that proves that maybe political capital is not the make or break for whether any of these agenda items get passed. So answers to link uniqueness are very useful for getting some of your other arguments more credence. Next, kind of thought about the 2AC, link turns should be specific to the AF. So you should always have cards that your particular plan is like popular in Congress, that it's bipartisan, whatever. You always want to have a card that is specific to the AF. I think it is also very useful to make link defense. So the plan goes through the DOD, which means it doesn't involve Congress in any way, is a link defense argument I would definitely make. And that shields the ability for that shields the idea that it would go through Congress. And then I mentioned this, but winners win is a useful link turn argument to have that is not specific to the plan, but is often something that cannot be solved by counter plans. And so is a useful, winners win is a useful link turn to have. The other thing I would do in the 2AC is make a couple of politics theory arguments. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because we don't have a ton of time. But the first and best is intrinsicness. So a logical policymaker could endorse or adopt the plan and also endorse whatever agenda item your disad is about. A logical policymaker would not forego the opportunity to vote for the drug pricing bill just because of the plan. That is an intrinsicness argument. Next is bottom of the docket is a theory argument that says the plan would not necessarily happen next on the congressional item agenda, but would be after the item that your disad is about. So there wouldn't be a trade-off because the debate over the plan would be after the debate over drug pricing or whatever. Third is fiat solves the link. So the whole premise of a politics disad is like there is a vote and there is controversy and people get really riled up about the plan. Fiat solves the link says that fiat is a magic wand that kind of overcomes that and means that that doesn't happen, that there's no debate over the plan, or that debate is necessarily limited enough that the agenda item can still pass. Similarly, Congress wouldn't backlash against itself. So if you say that the politics disad says that there is a backlash against what has just happened, it doesn't make any sense that Congress would backlash against something they voted for. And then finally, and this one is really weird, vote no is an argument that the debate that you're currently having means that the debate in Congress has already been initiated, which means that the loss of political capital is inevitable even if you vote neg. So that this debate means that the bill has been introduced, which means that there's already going to be controversy. So even if you vote neg, that doesn't solve the disad because it has already happened. The link has already happened. Okay, so this, again, it's really weird. So the idea is this debate, we are basically Congress. So having introduced the plan in this debate means that there is already going to be controversy over it. So voting negative doesn't solve your disad, because this debate means the controversy has already happened. Does that make sense? Yeah. So really weird, but throws some people off. I'll be really quick on the 1AR and the 2AR. The 1AR, I think you should consider straight turning the disad or making only offensive arguments if you have no solvency deficit to their counter plan, or if you know that you're right about this set of issues and the negative hasn't read the correct evidence to overcome the straight turn evidence, Or if you're certain that they don't want to go for politics and they really want to go for the other thing, like maybe there's a critique in the block and you know that they really want to go for that, straight turning can mess up the 2NR because it makes it so they have to go for the disad that you know they don't want to go for. If you're not straight turning, you just a couple of things to think about. You want to answer any turns case arguments or any new block impacts. You want to extend the arguments that are the best against the disad. So it is not necessarily the case that you extend the arguments that the block has spent the least time on, because they will often spend less time on less important or less quality arguments. And you want to extend the arguments that are the highest quality, that have the best possibility of winning you the debate. And then read evidence, read cards on politics in the 1AR. I cannot emphasize this enough. Like I said, one of the ways that politics disads win is that the negative overwhelms you with too many cards, and you want to counteract that by reading cards on your best argument in the 1AR. Yes. Straight turning means that you're just making offensive arguments. So instead of like including a bunch of defensive arguments about like no impact, no internal link, you're either just link turning, meaning just reading non-unique and link turns, or just reading impact turns. So that is, yeah, that's straight turning. And I would do that if you want to make them go for politics and not the other thing that they have, or if it's the only way you can get offense. 2AR on politics, you want to pick 1 to 2 arguments. So you do not need to extend everything. You want to really select your best couple of arguments. You want to exploit weaknesses in the next evidence and in 2NR execution, which requires reading through negative evidence to identify where it's weak. So between the 1A and the 2A, you should be able to read through the evidence to figure out where is their evidence not as good as they say it is. You want to emphasize your best arguments, which are often just logical assessments of why the argument is silly. So all of what we've talked about today should bake into your politics debating some thinking about, like, do I think that this is plausible? Do I think that the causal link chain that they have set up here is something that could theoretically happen? And you want to read through their evidence with that eye. Like, where do I think that this is unlikely, implausible, and that I can really sit down on, this is not true, this is unlikely, they are selling you a selling you a bill of goods. And so you want to emphasize those arguments. And finally, use good cross-ex moments in the 2AR. One of the reasons that I emphasized, and we spent time on cross-ex of the 1 and C, is that you can start to introduce some doubt about the credibility of the argument for the judge. And by the 2AR, you can cash in on that doubt by saying, hey, remember in cross-ex when they had no answer to or no answer for the set of people who would change their vote on this issue, or the set of the demographic that will suddenly show up to vote when they weren't otherwise going to vote, or whatever. Like, you can use those cross-ex moments to get across to the judge that they're believing some things that are specious or unlikely to be true. Questions? Fair enough. Oh, yes, go ahead.
So when you were saying that the fiat solves the loop,
Mhm. Yeah, no problem. This is just so all that category of arguments for like politics theory arguments that you can introduce in the 2AC to say, hey, the thesis of this disad doesn't make logical sense. So like the whole premise of it is flawed. And fiat solves the link is the argument that we're all agreeing that the plan has to have happened, right? With fiat means should, not would. So we are assuming that the plan happened, and the process of the plan having happened should overcome their arguments about what the political effects. So fiat overcomes or overwhelms the idea that there would be debate because enough people have to have agreed to the plan for it to have passed, right? And so it doesn't make sense for you to be like, oh, all these people oppose it when we have agreed that enough people supported it for it to pass.